The sun wasn't even trying that morning. It hung low and gray behind a veil of clouds that looked like soaked concrete. The kind of day where nothing quite wakes up, not even the birds, and even the traffic lights flicker like they're on the verge of quitting. On the corner of Vine Street and Beasley Avenue stood Henry's Diner, a no-frills, time-worn eatery nestled between a rundown pawn shop and a dry cleaner that always smelled faintly of mildew. The sign above the door had lost most of its paint. But inside, it was warm, buzzing with the clink of forks against cheap porcelain and the low hum of an old radio struggling to stay in tune. Clarence Dupree arrived the same way he always did, quietly, without ceremony. His boots were worn, the soles nearly flat. His army jacket, threadbare at the cuffs, still carried the faded outline of a patch long since removed. He walked with the kind of dignity that couldn't be faked, even if his back was a little stooped and his knees stiff from winters spent sleeping in shelters. He pushed open the door and nodded once at Carla, the waitress with the tired eyes and the warmest smile on the block. "Morning, Mr. Dupree," she said, not skipping a beat as she balanced 3 plates on her arm. "You want your usual?" He nodded, his voice low. "If the toast ain't burnt this time." She chuckled. "No promises." Clarence moved toward the back corner, booth by the window, seat against the wall, his spot. Always his spot. From there, he could see the entire diner without anyone getting behind him. Habits died hard, especially when they were carved into muscle by war. He slid in, back straight, hands folded. He didn't need a menu. He never had. Behind the counter, Harold, the owner and reluctant short-order cook, glanced up from the grill. "You know that man could run this place better than me," he muttered to Carla as she passed by. "That man's the reason half these folks show up every Tuesday," she whispered back. To most who wandered in off the street, Clarence looked like a man holding on by a thread. No home, no car, no phone. But inside this diner, he wasn't a case number or a cautionary tale. He was Clarence. A man who tipped in crumpled bills but never left a mess. A man who spoke little but listened much. A man who'd seen more than he ever said. He watched the small TV bolted above the counter as Carla poured his coffee. The news was on, another segment about veterans losing benefits, another suit in Washington shrugging off responsibility. Clarence didn't scowl. He just exhaled, slow and steady, then turned his eyes back to the street. Outside, life moved on. Parents dropped off kids at the nearby elementary school. A sanitation truck groaned past. College students with oversized backpacks drifted down Vine toward Mercer University, faces glued to their phones. None of them looked twice at Henry's. And none of them noticed Clarence, which was exactly how he preferred it. His coffee came, black as tar and just as bitter. He didn't stir it. Didn't add sugar or cream. Just sipped and waited. That was Tuesday. That was how it had been for years. But this Tuesday wasn't like the others. The first thing Clarence noticed was the silence that followed the bell above the door. It didn't ring like it usually did. This time it clanged, sharp and quick. 2 men in uniform stepped inside. Not regulars. Not even familiar faces. Police officers. The taller one had the kind of build that suggested he used to play football and hadn't quite let go of the glory. The other was shorter, squatter, clipboard in hand like it was a shield. Clarence knew trouble when it walked in. He didn't flinch. He just took another sip. Carla froze mid-step. "Morning, officers," she offered, keeping her voice neutral. They didn't answer. The taller one, Langley, his name glinted off a silver tag, scanned the room like he owned it, like he was looking for something out of place. His eyes landed on Clarence. Locked in. Clarence set down his cup. His eyes didn't waver. Langley approached with slow, deliberate steps. "Sir," he said, stopping at the edge of the booth. "You a customer here?" Clarence blinked once, then nodded. I am. You buy anything? The other one, asked. Coffee, Clarence said. Breakfast's on the way. Langley looked toward the counter. You got a receipt? Carla took a step forward. He's fine. He comes in every week. Paid already. Langley didn't look at her. Did I ask you? Clarence didn't raise his voice. You can ask her. She took the order. Got ID? Asked. Clarence moved slow, deliberate, reaching into the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a cracked leather wallet and slid a card across the table, his VA card, laminated and faded. Langley picked it up, squinted. This all you got? It's all I need. Snorted. We'll see. Clarence said nothing. The diner was quiet now, humming with discomfort. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. A couple at the next booth stared at their coffee. A delivery guy waiting by the door shifted on his feet. Carla brought his plate, setting it down with a tremble in her wrist. Langley looked at the food. He already ordered. He's a regular, Carla said. Pays cash. Always polite. Always leaves a tip. Narrowed his eyes. You homeless? Clarence paused, then nodded. Don't have a house. But I got a home. Langley smirked. Smart mouth. Clarence picked up his fork. Just trying to eat. But the meal was already ruined. The warmth of the coffee had cooled. The eggs didn't taste like anything anymore. Clarence could feel it coming, the moment things would shift. He'd felt it before, overseas, when the wind changed, when the silence got too quiet. He reached slowly into his jacket again. Not for a weapon. Not for a wallet. For a phone. Old, scratched, the kind with a flip screen. He pressed one button. Who you calling? Langley asked, voice sharp. Clarence held the phone to his ear, waited, then said 5 words that changed everything. It's happening again. Right now. And just like that, the real story began. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The coffee was cold now, but Clarence didn't move. The flip phone lay face down next to his plate, screen dark, the weight of it heavier than it looked. Across the table, his untouched eggs began to congeal. Outside the diner window, the world moved like it always did, cars inching forward at stoplights, delivery trucks honking, a child chasing a plastic bag like it was treasure. But inside, everything had gone still. Carla lingered a few feet away, her hands clenched into fists, unsure whether to step closer or back away. Harold had stopped flipping pancakes. The spatula hung loose in his hand like a forgotten weapon. Even the radio had fuzzed into silence. Clarence sat with his back to the wall and his eyes unfocused, not on the officers anymore but somewhere far away, past the fog of now and deep into a place that only he knew. He'd once sat like this in another room, thousands of miles away. The floor had been sand, the air choked with smoke, and the walls made of canvas, flapping with the wind. They called it a secure post, but nothing about it felt safe. That was Iraq, Fallujah, 2006. Back then, Clarence Dupree had been Sergeant Dupree, second in command of a small, quiet unit no one officially acknowledged. Task Force Wolfhound. Their mission wasn't to hold ground or train locals. Their mission was to bring people back, hostages, assets, names on CIA printouts. Sometimes they came home alive. Sometimes they didn't. Clarence remembered the heat first. It wasn't the sun that burned you, but the ground. It cooked your boots from the soles up. They used to joke that if you stood still too long, your shadow would scream. The memory came without permission. The blood. The screaming. The boy with a rifle half his size. The way bullets didn't care who was right or wrong. Clarence could still smell cordite when the diner's scent faded for a second, until Carla's voice snapped him back. "Clarence," she said softly. "You okay?" He blinked, just once, then looked up. The spell broke, the ghosts scattering back into the corners of his mind where they waited for quieter moments. He nodded. Not fast, not slow. Just enough to signal he'd returned from wherever his thoughts had taken him. Carla relaxed a little, enough to take a step forward, but her eyes never left the phone. "You want me to?" "No," Clarence said. His voice was calm, like always, but there was an edge to it now. A wire pulled tight beneath the surface. Langley hadn't moved much. He stood with one hand on his belt and the other near his radio, like he was still trying to decide if he'd just made a mistake or if he still had time to double down. Ree looked nervous. He kept glancing at the door like he expected someone to walk through at any second. He wasn't wrong. Clarence leaned back in the booth and picked up his fork again. He didn't start eating. He just held it. The weight of it was familiar, grounding. "You think that phone call's gonna scare us?" Langley asked, finally breaking the silence. "You think you can just flash a VA card and call your little veteran hotline?" Clarence didn't answer. He didn't need to. The flip phone buzzed once, soft, quick. He reached for it and opened it again, reading the screen without emotion. One message. No words. Just a 3-digit number, 302. He nodded slightly and closed the phone. Langley didn't like that. His jaw tightened. What's 302 supposed to mean? Clarence finally looked at him, really looked. "It means you've got maybe 5 minutes before you wish you hadn't walked in here." The room shifted again. Carla covered her mouth. Ree's hand inched toward his notepad but froze halfway there. Harold stepped out from behind the counter, his towel hanging limp over one shoulder. "Officers," Harold said carefully, his voice low and respectful, but with a firmness that wasn't negotiable. "This man is a veteran. He eats here every week. He pays cash. He doesn't start trouble. If you don't have a warrant or a real complaint, I suggest you step outside and wait for whoever it is he just called." Langley's mouth twitched like he wanted to argue, but Ree pulled at his sleeve. "We should go, man. Just step outside. Take a breath." Langley hesitated. He was a man used to getting the last word, used to barking and watching people flinch. But Clarence didn't flinch. He never had. Not when mortars screamed from the sky. Not when he had to carry his squad leader's body out of a bombed-out building with blood soaking through both uniforms. Not when they left him alone at the VA for 8 hours because someone lost his paperwork. He'd never once flinched for cowards pretending to be in control. "You're making a big deal out of nothing," Langley muttered, stepping back. Clarence's voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a blade. "You're the one who made it a scene." Langley didn't respond. He just walked stiffly to the door, Ree trailing behind. The bell clanged again as it closed behind them. Inside, the air remained tense. Clarence sat still for a moment longer before finally lifting his fork and taking one bite of eggs. They were lukewarm, a little rubbery, but he chewed slowly, deliberately, like reclaiming a ritual. Carla stood by, still unsure. "You sure you're okay?" she asked again. Clarence didn't look up. He swallowed, then said, "I've been worse." He ate a strip of bacon, washed it down with cold coffee, then sighed. The worst was yet to come, and he knew it. But he also knew something else. Whatever was about to unfold had been waiting to happen for a long, long time. And this time, he wasn't going to stay silent. Outside, the first squad car was joined by a black government sedan. Clarence didn't look. He didn't need to. He'd already felt the shift. Tuesday morning had finally woken up. And now, so had the city. Officer Langley stood just outside the glass door of Henry's diner, arms crossed, jaw set, pacing a tight, frustrated line across the sidewalk like a man holding back a punch. Ree stood further down by the cruiser, muttering into his radio, his voice low and clipped. From inside, Clarence watched them through the window without flinching, one hand wrapped loosely around his coffee mug, the other resting near the closed flip phone. Carla moved behind the counter with a rhythm that had lost all confidence, her hand trembling slightly as she refilled salt shakers that didn't need refilling. Harold stood near the griddle, arms folded across his chest, eyes locked on the front door. He wasn't cooking anymore. Nobody was ordering. The diner had turned into a waiting room, and everyone knew something was coming through that door again. Clarence didn't like being watched. Not like this. Not like some kind of threat or spectacle. It reminded him too much of checkpoints overseas, of being scanned by eyes behind sunglasses and assault rifles, judged in a language of suspicion. And now, after all these years, it was happening again, only this time, the uniform on the other side of the judgment wasn't camouflage, and the battlefield was a diner in Georgia. The front door opened again, and Langley stepped in. His tone had shifted. No longer confrontational, but still charged. There was a weight to the way he walked now, slower, more deliberate, like he knew he had already stepped in it but didn't know how deep. "Sir," he said, addressing Clarence, his voice just shy of respectful. "We're going to need to ask you to come outside with us for a few questions." Clarence didn't move. He looked at Langley, steady and flat. "Why?" Langley's brow twitched. "We received a call earlier this morning from a resident nearby about suspicious individuals loitering near this location." Clarence's lips barely moved. "You didn't talk to anyone outside before you came in here." Langley cleared his throat. "We're just following up. Standard procedure." "Standard procedure doesn't start with you walking straight to my table," Clarence said, calm as stone. "Didn't ask anyone else for receipts. Didn't check the kid on the laptop by the window. Didn't stop the guy in construction boots who hasn't ordered a thing since he walked in. Just me." Langley hesitated. "Look, it's nothing personal." "It never is," Clarence said, and he could feel the room around him tightening. Carla had stopped pretending to work. A mother in the back with her 2 kids was watching intently now, one hand frozen above her son's plate of scrambled eggs. "I'm asking you," Langley said again, a little more force behind his voice this time. "Come outside. Answer a few questions." Clarence leaned forward, setting the mug down gently. "Am I being detained?" Langley's jaw ticked. "No, but..." "Then I'll finish my breakfast," Clarence said, his voice so soft it felt louder than a shout. Langley stood there, wrestling with himself, with protocol, with ego. The man didn't like being told no. Didn't like it from his wife, from his chief, and especially not from a homeless black veteran sitting in a diner booth like he owned the place. The bell above the door rang again. This time, it wasn't Langley or Ree. It was a third figure, dressed not in uniform but in a navy blue overcoat, sharp shoes, and a gaze that silenced every murmur in the diner. He moved like someone who didn't need to announce who he was. He didn't have to. He walked straight to Clarence's booth, reached into his coat, and held up a black leather wallet that flashed with golden letters and the seal of the United States Department of Justice. "Assistant Director Mark Sorrell," he said, not to Clarence, but to Langley. "I need your badge number." Langley looked stunned. "Sir, Now." Langley blinked, floundering. "We were just responding to..." "There was no formal complaint," Sorrell said sharply. "We monitor keyword chatter on open frequencies. This stop was flagged within 60 seconds. Carla gasped. Clarence just sat there, still as ever, watching the scene unfold with quiet eyes. Sorrell turned to Ree, who had stepped inside behind Langley, shoulders drawn tight. "You, too. Badge number." Reed fumbled with his ID, hands shaking slightly. Both of you are currently being recorded, Sorrel continued. You violated protocol the moment you began questioning a civilian without cause. You escalated an encounter with a known veteran in good standing based on nothing but appearance. And you've done it on camera. Langley was beet red. With all due respect, sir, you're not my supervisor. Sorrel's smile was razor-thin. No. I'm your investigation. Clarence exhaled. One long, slow breath. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. Everything he had endured, everything he had swallowed quietly for years, now sat like an unspoken truth in the middle of the room, undeniable and burning. Sorrel looked down at him. You all right, Clarence? Clarence gave the smallest nod. Didn't want to call you. I know, Sorrel said. But you were right to. Langley opened his mouth again, but Sorrel cut him off. You're done here. Step outside. Internal Affairs will contact your precinct within the hour. Langley stared, eyes flicking around the room. Everyone was watching. Everyone saw. And that terrified him more than any punishment. The shame of being witnessed. The two officers walked out slowly, heads lowered, not saying a word. Outside, the cruiser door slammed shut a little too hard. The silence inside the diner lingered like dust after a collapse. Carla approached with the coffee pot again, refilled Clarence's cup. On the house, she whispered. Clarence shook his head. Put it on me. I always pay. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled $5 bill. As he slid it across the table, the people in the diner didn't clap. They didn't speak. But something had changed. For the first time in years, Clarence Dupree was no longer invisible. He was being seen. And the eyes that had once ignored him were wide open now. Clarence stared into his coffee as if it might offer some clarity in the quiet storm that had settled over Henry's diner. The eggs on his plate had gone lukewarm and the toast had curled slightly at the edges, but he hadn't touched a bite since Langley and Ree had walked back out into the light and into whatever was waiting for them now. The seat across from him still held the residual tension of their presence, as if the vinyl itself remembered their tone. Carla stood behind the counter trying to pretend she was refilling sugar dispensers, but her eyes kept drifting to him like she was waiting for the next moment to explode. Harold remained near the pass-through window, arms folded, eyes distant, jaw tight like he was chewing on his own regrets. Clarence wasn't angry. Not anymore. Anger had burned itself out in him years ago, back when he realized that rage didn't change a damn thing except the way people looked at you. What he felt now was something older and heavier. A kind of bone-deep exhaustion that didn't come from walking miles or sleeping on church floors. It came from being questioned for merely existing. It came from having to explain, again, why he deserved to sit in a public place and eat a plate of eggs without someone asking him to justify it. He finally picked up his fork and cut a piece of egg, chewing slowly, reclaiming a little bit of the morning. Sorrel was still standing near the booth, hands behind his back, eyes steady but no longer sharp like earlier. He looked at Clarence the way only someone who had shared a war with you could. There was no pity in his gaze, no apology. Just wait. Shared wait. Clarence swallowed and took a sip of coffee. You sure showing up in a government car with a badge that shiny wasn't a little overkill? Sorrel raised an eyebrow. Would you rather I sent a memo? Clarence chuckled, a short breath of amusement that barely moved his shoulders. You scared the hell out of half the room. They needed scaring, Sorrel replied. He pulled a chair from the table next to them and sat down across from Clarence. Besides, you didn't exactly call the customer service line. You used the back channel. Clarence didn't answer right away. He looked down at his plate, nudged a piece of bacon with his fork, then looked back up. I wasn't trying to start anything. You didn't, Sorrel said. They did. All you did was pick up the phone after they made sure you had no other choice. Clarence looked out the window. The black sedan he'd seen earlier was still parked at the curb. No one had touched it. No one dared. "They'll say I overreacted. They'll say a lot of things," Sorrel replied. "Some will scream it from podiums. Others will whisper it into microphones behind closed doors. Doesn't matter. We've got the footage. The audio. Body cams, security cams, 2 witness statements already filed by people who were eating breakfast 3 feet from you." Clarence's eyes narrowed slightly. "They're talking already?" Sorrel nodded. "The city doesn't know it yet, but a fuse just got lit under its feet." Carla approached with a fresh pot of coffee and poured into Clarence's cup without asking. She didn't leave right away this time. She lingered a moment, looking at Sorrel. "You gonna fix this?" Sorrel's answer was simple. "That depends on how broken it really is." She gave him a long look, then turned to Clarence. "You need anything else, Mr. Dupree?" Clarence shook his head gently. "You've already done enough." Carla didn't smile. Not because she didn't want to, but because something told her smiling would cheapen the moment. She nodded and stepped away, the coffee pot still in her hand, but her shoulders straighter than they had been all morning. Sorrel leaned in slightly. "They've already contacted the precinct. Internal Affairs wants interviews by the end of the day. You'll be getting a call too." Clarence raised an eyebrow. "They want my version." "They need it," Sorrel said. "And you should give it." Clarence stared at him. "You know I hate this." "I know," Sorrel said quietly. "But this time, it's not about you. It's about the ones who don't have your history, your phone number, your friends in high places. It's about the ones who get dragged out of diners and don't have anyone to call." Clarence breathed through his nose, slow and long. He didn't like being the symbol. He didn't want to be the story. He didn't want to be anybody's proof of injustice. He just wanted breakfast. But deep down, he knew Sorrel was right. He looked back at the front door. The sun was climbing a little higher now, the clouds breaking apart just enough to cast sharp shadows onto the sidewalk. Langley and Ree were nowhere in sight. But Clarence knew they weren't gone. Not really. Men like them didn't vanish. They just retreated, regrouped, reworded their reports. Clarence reached into his coat again and pulled out a small, weathered notepad. He opened to a blank page and clicked his pen. He wasn't writing his statement. Not yet. He was making a list. Names. Dates. Memories that might help when they came asking. He didn't owe it to them, but he owed it to the ones who'd gone through worse and never got the chance to speak. Sorrel stood slowly. "I'll be back later. If they come sniffing around before then, call the number on the card." "You have my word." Clarence nodded without looking up. He was already writing. Sorrel left without fanfare. No salute. No handshake. Just the soft click of polished shoes walking out the same way they came in. Harold approached quietly and dropped a fresh napkin beside Clarence's plate. "You ever think this place would turn into a battlefield?" Clarence didn't look up. Everywhere is a battlefield. Some just pretend better than others. Harold gave a low grunt and returned to the kitchen. Clarence set his pen down and picked up his fork. The eggs were cold, but he didn't mind. They were just eggs. But the moment, this morning, it was something else entirely. It was the first shot in a different kind of war. One he didn't choose. One he wouldn't run from. And now that the city had asked the question, Clarence Dupree was going to make sure they heard the answer. The phone wasn't much to look at. Scratched plastic casing, the hinge a little loose, the screen barely bright enough to see in daylight. But the weight of it in Clarence's jacket pocket had always felt heavier than it should, like it carried more than circuits and plastic. It held access. And Clarence had only ever pressed that number once before. The first time had been in Atlanta, 5 years ago, when 3 police officers pulled him from a bus station bench and pushed him into a holding cell without charges. He hadn't used it since. Not when he got turned down for housing despite his honorable discharge. Not when he slept outside a church during a snowstorm with pneumonia burning in his lungs. Not when he walked 10 miles to a VA office just to be told his paperwork had been misfiled again. But today, in a quiet booth at Henry's Diner, staring down 2 officers who saw only the color of his skin and the wrinkles in his coat, Clarence had reached for the phone like a soldier reaching for his last bullet. He hadn't needed to speak more than 5 words. "It's happening again. Right now." That was all. The voice on the other end hadn't even replied. There'd been a click, a silence, and then the call had ended. Clarence didn't need confirmation. That number wasn't for emergencies. It was for certainties. And what happened in Henry's that morning had been a certainty, of bias, of misuse of power, of something that had gone on too long and too loud to keep swallowing without choking on it. Outside, a second black car had arrived, larger than Sorrel's. Tinted windows. Government plates. No lights, no sirens, just presence. A message. People walking down the block slowed, stared, crossed the street. The diner was no longer just a local spot. It had become a spotlight. And Clarence felt it pressing on his shoulders like a backpack filled with bricks. Carla stepped out from the back with a dish towel in her hands, her expression tight with something between awe and concern. She walked to the booth and leaned in, voice low. "Who did you call, Clarence?" He looked up at her, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Someone who still answers when I call." She chewed on that for a moment. "Government?" He nodded once. "Used to work alongside me. We bled in the same sand." Carla swallowed hard. "You don't talk about that much." "Doesn't buy coffee," he said. She gave a dry little laugh, but there was no humor in it. "What now?" Clarence didn't have an answer. Not a real one. He'd taken the shot. Now the echoes would decide what followed. Sorrel had left, but Clarence knew he wasn't far. That car outside wasn't there for Langley and Rhee. It was there for cover. For optics. Maybe for leverage. Harold walked over with a second mug and set it down without saying anything. Then he sat across from Clarence, rubbing his thick hands together like trying to warm them even though the diner wasn't cold. "Whatever you did," Harold said slowly, "you shook something loose." Clarence sipped his coffee. "Wasn't trying to shake anything." "Doesn't matter," Harold said. "You did." They were already standing outside before the eggs got cold. "I've never seen suits move that fast unless it was about a photo op or a pay raise." Clarence shrugged. "Guess I'm the wrong kind of photo op." "No," Harold said, leaning in, "you're the kind they don't want in the photo at all." Clarence glanced at the flip phone again. It sat on the table like an unexploded mine. Carla returned with a fresh pot, topped everyone off, then lingered once more. "They're gonna come ask questions, you know," she said. "Press. Investigators. Maybe even someone from the mayor's office. You ready for that?" Clarence stared out the window. "They're not coming to ask. They're coming to spin it. To make it smaller than it was. Less ugly. More comfortable." Carla's lips pressed tight. "Then don't let them." Clarence looked back at her. Her eyes weren't trembling anymore. She stood taller than she had that morning when she'd first poured his coffee. Something had shifted. Not just in her, but in everyone. Even the customers who had pretended not to watch were now staring openly. The couple at the far table. The young man with the laptop. An older woman seated by herself with a cane resting against the wall. They were listening now. Clarence pushed the phone toward Harold. "Keep it here. If they ask, it's the only thing I own that still works right." Harold picked it up like it was sacred. It looks like it belongs in a museum. Clarence smirked. So do I. The bell above the door jingled again, but this time it wasn't a badge or a suit. It was a young woman in jeans and a hoodie, phone in hand, hair pulled back in a messy bun. She stepped inside like she knew exactly who she was looking for. You him? She asked, walking straight to Clarence's booth. He looked up. Excuse me. You're the guy in the video. The veteran. The one they tried to mess with. Clarence raised an eyebrow. What video? She turned her phone around. On the screen, a shaky body cam video played. Langley's voice. Clarence's calm answers. The moment the flip phone was pulled. The moment Sorrel walked in. It had been clipped, edited, paired with dramatic music. Over 500,000 views. The caption read, "Hero in a booth." Clarence looked away. Didn't ask to be filmed. She shrugged. Didn't need to. People know the truth when they see it. He shook his head slowly. Sometimes truth just makes people mad. The girl smiled. Then maybe they need to get mad. She left as quickly as she'd arrived. Outside, more people were starting to gather. Small, quiet. Curious. They didn't knock. They didn't shout. They just looked through the glass like Clarence was some kind of monument. But he wasn't. He was just a man with a flip phone and one number that still worked. And that number had changed everything. By the time Mark Sorrel reappeared, the temperature inside Henry's had changed. Not in degrees, but in density. The quiet had thickened. The energy had turned dense and expectant, like a curtain pulled taut before a scene shift. The patrons weren't just eating anymore, they were watching, pretending not to, but their ears were tuned to every word, every movement, every intake of breath from the man seated in the back corner booth. Clarence Dupree sipped his coffee like he had all the time in the world, though even he could feel the ripple that was about to break through the glass. The bell above the door gave a soft chime, barely audible over the hum of conversations that trailed off mid-sentence. Sorrel stepped in, no longer in the sharp suit from earlier. He had changed into something even more official, a dark windbreaker bearing the embroidered seal of the Department of Justice and a silver lapel pin that gleamed like a warning. His presence didn't scream power. It whispered authority. The kind that made people sit up straighter without knowing why. Clarence didn't look up right away. He didn't need to. He knew that cadence, the controlled rhythm of shoes that had walked through embassies and combat zones and congressional hearings. Sorrel paused in front of the booth, not speaking, just standing there long enough to let the room adjust to his arrival. Then he slipped into the seat across from Clarence like this was a conversation they'd been having for years. Your video's got traction, Sorrel said, straight to the point. Clarence set down his mug. Wasn't my video. Doesn't matter. It's got over 2 million views in under 10 hours. Picked up by 3 local stations, 2 regional outlets, and it's climbing the charts on national threads. Hashtag Clarence Dupree is trending in 5 cities. Clarence stared at him. They turned it into a hashtag. They turned it into a movement. Clarence leaned back, jaw tightening. I didn't ask for that. I know. That's why it's real. Sorrel set a thin folder on the table and opened it. Inside were still images from the body cam, press screenshots, a partial transcript of Langley's questioning, and a typed summary of events. The language was cold, clinical, but the images weren't. One showed Clarence mid-sentence, fork in hand, eyes locked on the officer across from him. Another froze the moment he flipped open his phone. A third showed the second Sorrel stepped into the diner, badge raised. The lighting was grainy, but the truth was sharp. They're trying to spin it, Sorrel said. Langley's already claiming you were belligerent before the camera was rolling. Ree's not saying anything, his union told him to shut up and sit tight. Sounds about right, Clarence muttered. But there's a problem, Sorrel continued. Your record is clean. Your service history is exemplary. You've got 2 bronze stars, 3 letters of commendation, and no criminal history of any kind. And then there's the footage. It doesn't lie. Clarence sighed. They'll say I provoked them just by sitting there. They might, Sorrel said. But now the question isn't what they say. It's what people see. And right now, they're seeing you. Clarence looked around. Carla was at the far end of the counter, pretending to organize syrup bottles. Harold had returned to the grill but wasn't flipping anything. A man near the window was pretending to scroll on his phone, but the screen hadn't moved in minutes. They were all listening. I don't want to be anybody's story, Clarence said quietly. You already are. Clarence stared out the window. So what now? Now, Sorrel said, we brace for the wave. The mayor's office will issue a statement within 24 hours. The police department will launch a formal investigation. Langley will probably be placed on administrative leave. Ree might resign to avoid press. And you? Clarence raised an eyebrow. Me? You'll be the face of the fallout, Sorrel said. Whether you want to or not. They're already digging into your past. Reporters are asking questions. There's a demand for an interview. CNN. MSNBC. Even a couple of conservative channels. They're all circling. Clarence pushed the folder back. I'm not playing their game. I'm not asking you to, Sorrel said. But you need to understand, you lit a fire. And now people who have ignored this kind of thing for years are suddenly pretending to care. Clarence exhaled through his nose. Pretending? You don't get genuine change from hashtags, Sorrel said. But you do get momentum. And sometimes, that's enough to force doors open. A car pulled up outside, another unmarked vehicle, this one larger, darker. From the back seat stepped a man in a gray suit and sunglasses, flanked by 2 aides. He looked like someone who signed memos without reading them. Sorrel saw him too. City Hall, he murmured. They want to get ahead of it. Clarence didn't move. Let them wait. Sorrel almost smiled. You sure you don't want to take the mic for this one? I've had enough microphones pointed at me when I didn't ask for them, Clarence said. Sorrel stood. They'll request a meeting. Probably try to offer some symbolic nonsense. A public apology. A plaque. Maybe a key to the city. They should give that key to Carla, Clarence said, glancing toward the counter. She's the one who spoke up first. She'll be mentioned, Sorrel promised. But this is going to keep getting bigger. Clarence looked up, eyes sharper now. Then make sure when it does, someone tells the truth. Not just about me. About all of us. Sorrel nodded. I'll make sure they hear it. He turned to leave, his coat catching a slight breeze as he opened the door. Outside, the press had started gathering, cameras on shoulders, phones raised, microphones extended like fishing rods dangling bait. As Sorrel stepped out, a wave of questions surged toward him, flashes exploding like lightning. Clarence remained seated. He picked up the phone Harold had set back on the table and flipped it open. No new messages. No missed calls. Just one screen. One saved number. One decision that had changed everything. And yet, he still hadn't said a single word to the world. Not yet. But it was coming. And when he did, they'd have to listen. Clarence had never cared for the internet. Not out of fear or stubbornness, but because it had always felt like noise. Loud, chaotic, disposable noise. He didn't own a smartphone. He'd never tweeted, posted, liked, or shared. The flip phone in his pocket was good enough for him. It made calls, received texts, and didn't ask for his location. In his world, things were simpler when you weren't always connected. But that didn't mean the world stayed quiet. In fact, by the time Clarence had finished the last bite of his now cold bacon, the noise outside had reached a fever pitch he couldn't ignore. Carla was the first to say it out loud. She came over holding her own phone, eyes wide, voice a whisper that barely covered her disbelief. "Clarence," she said, "you're everywhere." She flipped the screen toward him, and even from across the table, he could see the sharp contrast of his face frozen in mid-sentence, the moment just before he flipped open his phone. The video was grainy, the sound uneven, but the power of the image was undeniable. It was already captioned with bold white text, "He just wanted breakfast." Below it, thousands of comments scrolled faster than her finger could track. Veterans. Activists. Teenagers. Mothers. Strangers. They were all weighing in. All watching. Clarence narrowed his eyes. "Where'd it come from?" Carla shook her head. "I don't know. Somebody got the body cam footage. Might have leaked. Maybe someone inside the department." He didn't speak. He just stared at the tiny screen, watching his own stillness replayed over and over. Each freeze frame a testimony. Each loop a new set of eyes judging, interpreting, reacting. It made his skin crawl. Not because he was ashamed, but because he knew how fast truth could twist once it got fed into the machine. Harold appeared behind Carla, holding a tablet someone had left charging behind the counter. He tapped it twice and turned it to face them. "You're trending," he said, voice low. Hashtag Clarence Dupree. 500,000 tweets. And that's just in the last hour. Clarence rubbed the bridge of his nose. "That a good thing?" Harold raised his eyebrows. "Depends who you ask." The diner's regular hum was gone now. Replaced by a steady undercurrent of digital murmurs and side eyes. People were no longer just here for pancakes. They were here for proximity to a moment. One young man near the window was streaming on Instagram Live, whispering his commentary like a wildlife narrator. A woman in a navy blazer had taken a seat by the register and started typing frantically into a laptop. Two high school girls in cheer uniforms snapped a photo outside the window, making peace signs and mouthing, "That's him," as they giggled. Clarence watched it all with the same expression he'd once worn while walking through a village in southern Iraq after a bombing. Careful. Detached. Measuring the air for shifts in pressure. Something about being the eye of a digital storm made him uneasy. He wasn't a man built for spotlights. He was built to endure. And this sudden adoration, however well-intentioned, didn't feel like safety. It felt like being surrounded. Carla sat across from him suddenly, her face no longer lit with amusement but with a kind of quiet urgency. "You need to see this," she said, opening a news clip. It was a short segment from a local station. They had already named the officers, already pulled Langley's disciplinary history, already looped Clarence's face between shots of protests from other cities. The anchor used words like racial profiling, abuse of authority, and veterans' dignity. They spoke about Clarence like he was a known figure. A symbol. But Clarence wasn't a symbol. He was a man who'd wanted eggs and coffee and nothing else. He stood slowly, pushing back the booth with a heavy scrape. The room quieted again. Every eye turned. Phones rose, like flags. Some took pictures. Others hit record. He walked toward the front window and looked out. There were people now, more than before. Holding phones, holding signs, holding expectations. One held a poster board with the words, "Justice for Clarence," written in black marker. Another had printed out a freeze frame of him sitting at the booth, laminated and framed in cardboard like a campaign image. It was surreal. He turned away from the window, walked slowly back to his booth, and sat down. Carla didn't speak. She just waited. "They're building something around me I didn't ask for," Clarence said at last. Carla nodded. I know. It won't stay pure, he continued. They'll twist it. Make it political. Make it loud. And in a week, maybe less, they'll move on to someone else. Maybe, she agreed. But while they're here, while they're listening, maybe it's time they heard what you really have to say. Clarence looked at her for a long moment, then down at the flip phone resting near his elbow. One number had changed the day. Now the internet was changing the week. And the thing about momentum, he knew, was that once it started rolling, it didn't ask for your permission. Outside, a reporter shouted his name through the glass. Mr. Dupree. Can we get a statement? Just a few words. Clarence didn't answer. He closed his eyes for a second, as if tuning out the noise, then opened them again, sharper now. Harold approached quietly, holding something in his hand, a small envelope. This just got dropped off by a guy in a VA jacket, he said. Said it was urgent. Clarence took it and opened it. Inside was a clean shirt, a prepaid cell phone, and a handwritten note. It read, "We've got your back. Your silence has been loud for too long. Speak when you're ready. And when you do, we'll be listening." Clarence folded the note and placed it inside his jacket pocket. He looked around the diner, at the people who had always seen him, and those who were seeing him for the first time. Maybe it was true, he didn't ask for this. But perhaps, finally, it had asked for him. And this time, he wasn't going to walk away. The question started as a whisper in the digital static, a quiet murmur under the flood of retweets, likes, and stitched reaction videos. It slipped between headlines and hovered beneath commentary threads, surfacing from those who refused to accept a man could carry such quiet strength without fanfare. Who is he? What's his story? Where did he come from? It wasn't enough anymore to see Clarence Dupree sitting stoically in a booth with scrambled eggs and a cup of black coffee. The world wanted context. Proof. Legacy. They wanted to know why a man with nothing looked like he had already given everything. It didn't take long for the digging to begin. The internet wasn't patient, and it wasn't kind. At first, they found the usual, a VA record confirming veteran status, honorable discharge, no home address, no employment history listed in the past 10 years. That alone was enough to draw sympathy, but not reverence. Sympathy came cheap. But then someone found a name buried in a decades-old article archived from a military newsletter, scanned and stored by a forgotten web server. Sergeant Clarence Dupree commended for valor in hostage recovery operation. The headline was dated June 17, 2006. The article had no byline, no pictures, just a short paragraph describing a classified operation in Fallujah and the brave actions of one soldier under fire. That was the spark. Soon after, someone else, another vet, one with a sharper memory and a clearer mission, posted a photo to Reddit. It was black and white, worn at the edges, showing 3 soldiers crouched in desert camo behind a burnt-out vehicle. Faces grim. Eyes sunken. Rifles slung but ready. In the center was Clarence, barely 30, wearing the same expression he had in the diner, focused, quiet, composed. The caption was short, "Clarence Dupree saved my life. Twice. Wolfhound 06. That word, wolfhound, caught like dry grass in a flame. People began asking questions. What was wolfhound? Why had no one heard of it? The answer, as it turned out, was both simple and classified. Task Force Wolfhound had been a joint special operations group assembled for high-risk hostage extractions and off-the-books intelligence sweeps during the peak of the Iraq War. The unit was never officially recognized. No medals were publicly awarded. No press releases were written. But the soldiers knew. And they remembered. One by one, they came forward, not with full names, not always with faces, but with memories. A quiet wave of confirmation began to build. Stories of Dupree crawling through enemy tunnels, covering teammates during ambushes, carrying wounded comrades through firefights without waiting for air support. Each account was more compelling than the last, and each one was delivered with the same refrain: he never asked for thanks. He just did the job. The media seized it quickly. First local, then national. The narrative changed almost overnight. Clarence Dupree was no longer just a homeless black veteran wrongfully questioned in a diner. He was a former covert operative. A soldier who disappeared into the margins. A man who had carried national secrets and then carried his own silence for years afterward. Cable news anchors read from scripts that barely scratched the surface. They played loops of the diner footage next to grainy photos from combat zones. Graphics flashed bold titles like, "From Forgotten to Front Page," and, "Clarence Dupree, Hero in the Shadows." Clarence didn't watch any of it. He didn't own a TV. He didn't even know what Reddit was. But he felt the shift. The way people walked into the diner differently now. The way their eyes lingered too long. Some nodded at him like they understood. Others couldn't look at him at all. One morning, a man in a crisp navy blazer stood outside the diner for 15 minutes just watching through the glass before leaving a small American flag folded on the step. Inside, Clarence stayed the same. Booth by the window. Coffee black. Eggs scrambled. Quiet. But the storm outside was swirling faster every day. Carla brought him his usual without a word, but her eyes brimmed with things she wasn't saying. Finally, after his second sip of coffee, she sat across from him and leaned in. "You really did all that?" she asked softly. Clarence didn't look at her. He just watched the coffee ripple slightly in the mug from the tremor in his hand. "What they're saying," she continued, "about the rescues. The missions. The hostages." He nodded once. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" Clarence looked up. His gaze was steady but distant, like it had taken him somewhere far before returning. "What would it have changed?" he asked. Carla shook her head slowly. "Maybe people would have seen you differently." Clarence offered a faint smile. "They see what they want. Not what's real." Harold approached the table then, holding a printout in his hand. "This just came off the fax line," he said, sliding it over. Clarence unfolded the page. It was a formal letter from the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, addressed to him by full rank and name. The letter was an apology. A recognition. An invitation to speak at a memorial event in Washington. It offered assistance. Housing. Resources. A VA caseworker. Travel arrangements. Therapy. Clarence folded it carefully and tucked it into his jacket. "You going?" Harold asked. Clarence didn't answer right away. What's the point in saying something now, after all these years? "Because maybe now," Harold said, "they'll listen." Clarence looked at him. "And if they don't?" "Then say it for the ones who never got the chance." Clarence sat with that. The booth felt different now, not just a seat but a stage. His quiet had always been his armor. But now, maybe, his words could be his weapon. Outside, more people gathered each day. Some came with signs. Others came just to stand and look. But none of them truly knew him. Not yet. But soon, they would. By Wednesday morning, Henry's diner didn't smell like just bacon and weak coffee anymore. It smelled like change, the kind that settles in before people realize they're breathing it. The booths were full before sunrise, not with regulars this time, but with reporters, social justice organizers, veterans from surrounding counties, and curious onlookers who normally wouldn't set foot in that part of town. Outside, news vans lined the curb like a parade of restless truth-seekers, their satellite dishes angled toward the sky as if waiting for divine confirmation. Clarence sat in his usual booth, his army jacket zipped halfway, staring at his cooling eggs with a gaze that hadn't changed even though everything around him had. The town was no longer watching from a distance. It had stepped into the conversation. At City Hall, the mayor had called for a press conference scheduled for noon. An email blast from the police department arrived early, cold and practiced, stating that officers Langley and Ree were placed on temporary administrative leave pending investigation. It was the kind of language that sounded like action without promising resolution. The statement included words like alleged, pending review, and internal process. But nobody outside the station was interested in process. They were interested in justice, and they wanted it now. Across town, students at Mercer University organized a walkout. A group of local veterans issued a public letter of support, citing Clarence by name and reminding the city that a Bronze Star didn't expire just because the ribbon faded. Even the local church bulletin posted a quote beneath the upcoming service times. A man who stood for his country shouldn't have to fight to sit in a booth. It didn't take long for the protests to begin, not wild, not unruly, but present. Just like Clarence. Silent, patient, undeniable. They gathered on the steps of the police department in waves. Not hundreds, but more than enough to be seen. Signs painted hastily on cardboard. A few printed posters bearing Clarence's face. The hashtag now emblazoned across shirts, banners, even coffee cups, hashtag I am Clarence Dupree. The phrase caught because it meant something. Because everyone had felt invisible at some point, had been judged too quickly, dismissed too easily. Clarence just happened to carry it in public, on camera, with grace that struck a nerve. Inside the diner, Clarence remained unmoved. He didn't ask for the spotlight. He didn't shift when people stared. He didn't respond when a camera crew poked their lens through the glass or when a journalist from a major outlet stood outside hoping to catch a word. He had nothing to prove and even less to sell. Carla refilled his coffee without asking, her movements slower than usual, more deliberate, like she understood that everything around them had turned sacred somehow. "Mayor's speaking today," she said, sliding a napkin onto the table. Clarence looked up. "What's she gonna say?" Carla shrugged. "Whatever she thinks will keep her seat warm next election." Clarence gave a faint smile. That's the problem with chairs. Some folks think they own them just because they got there first. From behind the counter, Harold snorted. "Preach." The door opened again and in walked Officer Daniels, the only cop in town Clarence had ever actually spoken to more than once without bracing for impact. Daniels was older, wiry, with gray in his beard and a slow, thoughtful way of speaking that made you feel like he meant every word. He removed his cap as he entered and approached Clarence's booth with visible hesitation. "Clarence," he said with a nod. Clarence looked up. "Daniels." Daniels took a breath. "I'm off duty. Not here on business." Clarence nodded once, guarded. "I just came to say," Daniels continued, "some of us, we saw what happened. And we're not okay with it." Clarence didn't speak. He waited. "I know it doesn't fix anything," Daniels added. "But there's folks in that department who were proud to serve. Who still remember what honor means. Langley doesn't speak for all of us." Clarence finally answered. "But he wears the same badge." Daniels flinched like he'd been hit in the stomach. He nodded slowly, then slid something onto the table, a small black pin in the shape of an eagle clutching arrows and olive branches. "My old unit," Daniels said. "Same as yours, back before I switched over to law enforcement. Thought maybe it should sit next to your coffee instead of gathering dust in my drawer." Clarence looked at the pin. He didn't reach for it. Not yet. But his gaze softened. Daniels straightened his posture. "You need anything, you let me know." Clarence didn't say thank you. He just nodded again, and Daniels took that as enough. As he left, a woman by the door stopped him. "You think the department's gonna do something real?" Daniels didn't break stride. "I think they're gonna have to." By noon, the mayor stood behind a podium with flags behind her and camera flashes in front. Her words were polished, rehearsed, deliberate. She called what happened at Henry's unacceptable, praised Clarence's courage under pressure, and promised a full and transparent investigation. But when reporters asked if she had spoken directly with Clarence Dupree, she faltered. Her answer was vague. She said he was being given space. Clarence watched the clip from Harold's tablet that afternoon, eyebrows low, jaw tight. Space, he muttered. Carla leaned over his shoulder. They think they're doing you a favor. Clarence shook his head. They just don't know how to handle someone they can't manage. Outside, a new sign had been taped to the glass by a young woman with a clipboard. It read, "This is where it happened. This is where it changed." Clarence didn't know what was coming next. He didn't know if the city's outrage would last longer than the news cycle or if the promises would hold through the next scandal. But he knew one thing, this wasn't just about him anymore. The town had seen. The town had reacted. And now, the town had a choice. Clarence wouldn't guide their hands. But he would watch what they did with them. Langley had disappeared from the streets by Thursday. Not vanished, exactly, but his patrol car was nowhere in sight, his usual haunts quiet, and his name no longer called over the department radio. Inside the precinct, people whispered in tight corners and behind closed office doors, because silence had become the safest language. Officers who once laughed loudest now walked on eggshells, watching as internal affairs carved a path through the building like a storm front. The file on Langley had always been thick, but now it was open wide on a long conference table, pages splayed, corners marked, timelines charted. What had once been dismissed as friction or overreach was now being called what it was: profiling, intimidation, abuse of authority. Clarence didn't need to read the reports to know what they contained. He had seen it in Langley's eyes that morning in the diner. The entitlement. The expectation that his uniform would shield him from consequence. But this time, the world hadn't looked away. And with the cameras still rolling, people had started digging into Langley's past like it was a crime scene. They didn't have to dig far. The first complaint had come 8 years ago. A teenager pulled over for a busted taillight, slammed against the hood, searched without consent. No drugs, no contraband. Just fear. The mother had filed a formal grievance. Nothing happened. Then there was the elderly man pushed out of a convenience store for loitering. He'd been waiting for his wife to bring the car around. Langley had shoved him hard enough to crack a rib. That case had gone nowhere, buried in legalese and departmental red tape. Then came the string of citations issued to unhoused people, mostly black men, sitting on benches, standing near bus stops, or simply walking at night. Each complaint faded into the background. Until now. Now, each of those stories was crawling back into the light. The media called it a pattern. Advocacy groups called it a systemic failure. The police union called it unfortunate timing. But Clarence called it familiar. He'd seen institutions protect their own before. Not just in the force, but in the military too. Cover your six. Don't make waves. Look the other way. The same culture, just in a different uniform. Back at Henry's, the booth felt smaller these days. The world had gotten louder, and Clarence's corner no longer offered the same refuge. People still came in, still nodded in his direction, but their faces held something new now: expectation. As if waiting for his next move. As if he owed them a statement, a stance, a speech. But Clarence had already made his statement. He'd made it when he didn't rise from that booth. When he didn't beg or argue or lash out. He had spoken through stillness. And now that the silence had been heard, everyone wanted more. Carla brought him a fresh cup of coffee and slid into the seat across from him before he could protest. They just aired another segment on Channel 7, she said. Had a woman on there, used to work at the probation office. She said she saw Langley rough up a kid right in the hallway once. Pinned him to the wall like he was a dog. Clarence didn't flinch. And back then, nobody said a word. They did, she said. But no one listened. Harold joined them with a plate of toast in one hand and a printed newspaper in the other. He dropped both onto the table. The headline was massive. Langley's trail of complaints triggers citywide audit. Below it, a black and white photo of Clarence, eyes cast downward, his hand resting near the flip phone. Harold pointed to the article. "You lit the fuse." Clarence shook his head. "No. The fuse was already there. I just stopped pretending it wasn't." He skimmed the article. It detailed names, dates, internal memos, and public statements that now seemed damning. But what caught Clarence's eye was one paragraph in the middle, an account from a former patrol partner of Langley's, who asked to remain anonymous. The quote read, "He always had a temper. Always picked the people he knew wouldn't push back. The ones who looked tired. Poor. Black. He called them low-hanging fruit." Clarence's jaw clenched. He wasn't surprised. But reading it in print hit different. "They're calling for his resignation," Carla said. "Community boards. Churches. The university. Even a few local business owners. They won't fire him," Harold said. "They'll make him step down. Package it like retirement. Let him keep his pension. Quiet exit. No accountability." Clarence looked at both of them. "Then we don't let them forget. Not this time." Outside the diner, more people had gathered, not a protest this time, but a vigil. They carried candles, signs with names of others who'd filed complaints against Langley and were ignored. The names were written in thick black ink on white poster board, surrounded by words like "Believe us" and "No more silence." It wasn't about Clarence anymore. It never had been, not entirely. He had become the spark, but the flame was now fed by dozens of voices long buried in the dark. The mayor issued another statement that evening. She promised transparency. Promised reform. Promised that all officers would undergo retraining. But her words sounded rehearsed, desperate. The city had seen too much to be placated now. And in living rooms across town, families watched Clarence's story unfold not as entertainment, but as a reckoning. Fathers talked to sons about what to do when questioned. Mothers prayed their daughters wouldn't be next. And somewhere in the middle of it all sat Clarence Dupree, quiet as ever, waiting. Not for applause. Not for a podium. But for the truth to keep walking forward without needing his boots to carry it. The booth at Henry's had become more than just a seat, it was now a destination. By the end of the week, people didn't just come in for breakfast. They came to see it. To sit near it. Some even asked to take pictures with it, as if Clarence's quiet defiance had seeped into the leather of the cushion and granted it sacred weight. Tourists, locals, activists, students, they filtered through the front door in steady waves, ordering coffee they wouldn't drink just to sit a few feet from the man who had upended a system without ever raising his voice. Clarence never said no when people asked to shake his hand, but he never invited them either. He was there to drink his coffee, eat his eggs, and try to make sense of a world that was suddenly more interested in what he represented than who he really was. One afternoon, a man with thick glasses and a backpack asked if he could take a selfie next to Clarence's table. The young man didn't even wait for an answer, he simply leaned in, smiled, clicked the picture, and said, "You're a legend, sir." Then he walked out before Clarence could reply. That happened 3 more times before Carla finally put up a hand-lettered sign that read, "Mr. Dupree is not an exhibit. Please be respectful." The sign didn't stop them, but it slowed the flow. Harold pulled Clarence aside later that day. They stood near the back door, away from the noise and the cameras and the awkward stares. Harold lit a cigarette, something he rarely did during working hours, and offered Clarence one. Clarence declined, but he didn't walk away. "This is getting out of hand," Harold said, blowing smoke into the breeze. You can't even eat in peace anymore. I was never really eating in peace, Clarence replied. People just weren't watching. Harold nodded, staring down the alley like he was trying to find the end of the conversation before it started. You think it's worth it? Clarence didn't answer right away. He looked up at the sky, watched a bird land on the roof of the pawn shop next door. I think it's long overdue. That night, Clarence watched the evening news from the shelter where he still spent most of his nights. The screen was small, the volume low, but he caught enough. A city councilwoman had publicly demanded that Officer Langley be removed from the department entirely. Another official suggested an independent civilian oversight committee be formed. And then, just as the segment was ending, a new clip aired, grainy footage from inside Henry's, showing Langley speaking to Clarence just before Sorrel entered. The audio was low, but the captioning made everything clear. You got smart answers, huh? Langley had said, eyes sharp, tone condescending. Clarence watched himself blink once, slowly, then respond, just trying to eat. The clip ended, and the anchor added that over 2.3 million people had now viewed the video on social media. Clarence didn't move. He sat on the edge of the cot, elbows resting on his knees, eyes on the blank screen long after it turned to weather. A man in the cot next to him, someone he'd seen before but never spoken to, cleared his throat. They say you a hero now. Clarence shook his head slowly. They say a lot of things. The man looked over. That cop, Langley, you think they'll really get rid of him? Clarence shrugged. If they don't, at least now they'll have to explain why. The man nodded and rolled onto his side. That was the end of it. In the shelter, words were currency, and silence was sometimes worth more. The next morning, when Clarence walked into Henry's, something felt different. There was no line at the door. No cameras. No reporters pretending to order toast just to linger. It was just the regulars. The ones who had been there before the storm and would still be there after it passed. Carla waved from behind the counter. Harold was flipping pancakes with the same calm precision he always had. Clarence stepped toward his booth, and stopped. Someone was sitting there. A woman in her 20s, maybe younger, hair braided, sweatshirt baggy, backpack beside her. She looked tired, like the weight of life pressed on her spine. Clarence didn't say a word. He didn't need to. She looked up, recognized him instantly, and started to rise. No need, Clarence said gently. You're good. She hesitated. This your seat, right? Only if nobody else needs it. He walked to the booth across from her and sat down. Carla brought him his coffee, set it down without speaking, but left a second mug on the table too. The young woman shifted, nervous. I've been, kinda out here lately. I didn't even know who you were till I saw all them people yesterday. Figured this was a place that maybe don't ask questions. Clarence sipped his coffee. Sometimes asking the wrong questions says more about the person asking than the person answering. She looked down at her chipped nails. People only see me when I mess up. Clarence nodded. That's how they keep control. They wait till you stumble, then point like they were watching the whole time. She smiled a little. I'm Mia. Clarence. Yeah, she said. I know. They sat like that for a long while, not talking much, just breathing the same air, drinking the same coffee, watching as the diner slowly returned to what it used to be. And maybe that was the most powerful thing of all. Not the protests, not the hashtags, not the news segments or the public apologies. It was this, two people who had been invisible for too long, finally sharing a quiet morning without being made to feel like ghosts. As the sun rose higher and the clink of silverware filled the space between them, Clarence looked over at Mia and saw something he hadn't seen in days. Peace. And he knew, in that small moment, that consequences didn't just fall on the guilty. Sometimes, finally, they brought relief to the ones who had waited too long for justice to come with a refill of coffee and a seat that no one had to fight for. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and too formal for anything good. It came by courier, not mail, hand-delivered by a man in a navy jacket with a Department of Veterans Affairs patch sewn neatly above the pocket. He didn't come inside Henry's. He stood outside the glass door, asked Carla to pass it to Clarence, and then disappeared without a word. The envelope sat on the counter for a while, untouched, as if even its weight might tilt the balance of the morning. When Clarence finally picked it up, he didn't open it. He tucked it inside his jacket and finished his coffee first. It wasn't until he was back at the shelter that he slid a finger under the flap and peeled it open with the same caution he used to disarm field triggers in Fallujah. Inside was a letter, heavy paper, embossed seal, typed lines too polished to feel sincere. It was from the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. The salutation used his full name and rank. Dear Sergeant Clarence Dupree. The rest unfolded in language that tried too hard to be respectful and not hard enough to be honest. They expressed their deepest regret for his experience. They acknowledged his many years of honorable service. They said the department had fallen short in upholding the dignity and care our veterans deserve. At the bottom was a handwritten note, an attempt at sincerity scrawled between lines of diplomacy. I'm sorry it took all this for us to see you. You deserved better. Clarence stared at the letter for a long time. He read it once, then again, slower. It was clean. It was professional. It was too late. He folded it carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and set it on the bedside table. He sat down on the edge of the cot, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the wall where a water stain shaped like the state of Georgia was spreading slowly across the ceiling. He didn't feel vindicated. He didn't feel angry. What he felt, more than anything, was tired. The letter had come with a list of benefits and offers. A housing voucher. A dedicated caseworker. A therapist available within 24 hours. A prepaid phone. A stipend to furnish a new apartment. All the things Clarence had asked for years ago, all the things denied or delayed or lost in the bureaucracy that chewed people like him up and spit out paper trails too worn to matter. Now, because a video went viral, because people saw a man sit still in a diner while two cops tried to take everything from him, the system had decided he was worthy. Clarence didn't know whether to laugh or scream. The next morning, he walked into Henry's like he always did, only this time he held the letter in his hand. Carla saw him come in and raised her eyebrows. He gave a small nod and slid into the booth by the window. The regulars were back. The air felt less charged, like the town had taken its first deep breath since the storm broke. Still, there was a new awareness that lingered beneath the surface, like the taste of smoke after a fire had passed. People didn't look at Clarence the way they used to. The glances were longer now, less curious and more cautious, as if recognizing too late that they'd shared space with someone who had fought battles they never saw. Carla brought his coffee, then sat across from him without asking. They finally say something? She asked, eyeing the envelope. Clarence pulled out the letter and handed it to her. She unfolded it, skimmed the first few lines, then shook her head slowly. Lord, she said. They always send flowers after the funeral. Clarence chuckled, soft and low. Ain't that the truth? She handed it back. What are you gonna do? Haven't decided. You gonna take the voucher? He looked out the window. They offered a place. Quiet neighborhood. Small apartment. Nice view, they say. You deserve it. Clarence didn't answer right away. He sipped his coffee and let the silence fill the space between them. Then he said, It's strange, Carla. I've been asking for help since the day I came back, and all I got was wait lists and check-ins and locked doors. Then I sit in a booth and don't move, and suddenly I'm worth something. Carla's face tightened. You were always worth something. They're the ones who didn't see it. He nodded. Yeah. But now I wonder if they're seeing me or just the story. Carla reached out and placed her hand over his. Doesn't matter. Take the roof. Take the bed. Take the damn couch. You earned all of it. Whether they meant it or not. Clarence looked down at her hand. It was warm, calloused, strong. The kind of hand that knew what it meant to work for something that never quite paid back what it cost. Later that afternoon, a representative from the VA arrived in a dark sedan and waited in the diner parking lot. Clarence walked out with the letter in his pocket and a cardboard box tucked under his arm. Inside were the few things he owned, an old photo, a worn Bible, the flip phone, and a toothbrush held together with tape. The rep was polite, nervous. He explained everything too quickly. Clarence just nodded and let the man talk. The apartment was waiting. They'd arranged for groceries, furniture, and anything else he might need. As they pulled away from the diner, Clarence looked back once. Carla was standing at the door, watching him go. She gave a small wave. He nodded in return. The apartment was small but clean. A bed with fresh sheets. A refrigerator that hummed softly. A window overlooking a patch of grass. It didn't feel like home. Not yet. But it didn't feel like nowhere, either. Clarence stood in the middle of the room for a long time, unsure what to do with the quiet. Then he walked over to the window, pulled the VA letter from his coat, and read it one last time. He folded it again and placed it in the drawer beside the bed. Then he sat down. Not because he was tired. But because, for the first time in a long while, he could. The apartment was too quiet. Not the kind of quiet that invited rest, but the kind that reminded you what you used to hear. Clarence sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the beige walls, the plain dresser, the clean carpet without a single footprint on it. The silence wrapped around him like an old uniform, familiar, heavy, and stitched with memories. There was no hum of the diner, no soft clatter of Carla's footsteps, no murmur of strangers sipping coffee and pretending not to watch. Just the sound of his own breath and the occasional creak of the air conditioner. And under it all, the hum of something older. Something buried. He didn't want it to come back, but it did anyway. It always started with the smell. Not of eggs or black coffee, but of smoke and hot metal. Burned rubber. Gunpowder. Then the color would drain from the room and be replaced with that yellow-gray haze that never really lifted in Fallujah. The wind carried dust into your mouth, into your ears, into the lines of your skin until even your sweat felt like sand. He could see it now, as if it were playing on the walls of his new apartment. A memory that never asked permission to return. They were 7 miles outside the green zone, convoy slowed down by a roadside checkpoint that didn't feel right. Too quiet. No goats, no children, no laughter behind crumbling stone walls. Just shadows. Clarence had been riding rear watch that day, one boot up on the side of the Humvee, rifle slung across his lap. The radio crackled. Then it went silent. That was the real warning. Radios don't go quiet unless something is jamming them. He remembered looking at Rains, his squad leader, and seeing the same realization hit him. That was the last second before it all turned to fire. The first blast came from the left. Not big, not a direct hit. Just enough to flip the second truck like a toy and fill the air with screaming. Clarence moved without thinking. Training did that to you. He dragged Miller, still breathing, legs mangled, behind the front wheel, used his own body to shield him as bullets raked the dirt. He could still feel the vibration of return fire pounding through his spine. He remembered looking up and seeing Rain's signal with his hand, split the team, flank wide. That's when Clarence moved again, sprinting low, cutting left, trusting his instincts to lead him behind the crumbling wall where the muzzle flashes had come from. He found the shooter. A boy. No older than 15. Skinny arms, dirty face, AK pressed so tight to his shoulder it looked like it was part of him. Clarence didn't hesitate. He fired twice. The boy dropped. He never even saw his eyes until he got closer. Just another silhouette, another shadow in the dust. But once the dust cleared, there he was. A boy with cracked lips and a necklace made from string and a bullet casing. Clarence had carried that necklace for a week before throwing it into the Tigris River. He told no one. He blinked, and the walls turned back to beige. The carpet under his boots was clean again. But his chest was tight. He hadn't had a flashback like that in months. The therapist back at the VA center once told him it was a delayed reactivation, brought on by new surroundings. She said the brain associated stillness with vulnerability. It made sense. Clarence had never had this much quiet. Not in the barracks. Not in shelters. Not in waiting rooms where people shuffled around him like he was part of the furniture. Here, the silence roared. He stood and walked to the window. The grass below was still damp from last night's rain. A kid in a yellow jacket rode a bicycle in slow loops on the sidewalk. A woman pushed a stroller past him, not even glancing up. No cameras. No protests. Just life. And it felt farther away than it ever had. He opened the drawer beside the bed and pulled out the letter from the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. He unfolded it, ran his fingers over the seal, then set it down. Next to it, he placed the folded VA-issued benefits brochure, the contact card for his assigned therapist, and the new phone he still hadn't activated. He stared at the stack. Everything they'd denied him for a decade. Now served like a peace offering. And yet none of it answered the question he hadn't been able to shake since the first time he sat in that diner booth and chose not to move. Why did it take a spectacle? Clarence had followed the rules. He'd filled out forms, waited in lines, showed his ID to blank-faced receptionists, called numbers that rang endlessly, wrote letters that were never answered. And still, he was forgotten. But one video, one moment of stillness in the face of injustice, and suddenly the world remembered him. It didn't feel like justice. It felt like theater. And he hated that. He didn't want to be anyone's trending topic. He wanted to be heard when no one was watching. He walked into the kitchen, opened the cabinet, pulled down the clean mug that came with the apartment. He brewed coffee from the VA starter kit, poured it black, sat back down at the small table near the window. The sun had shifted across the sky now, casting a beam of light across the table where the letter sat. It glowed like an invitation. He pulled a pen from his jacket and took out a yellow notepad from the box he'd packed at the shelter. He wrote slowly, deliberately, line by line. You saw me because I sat still. But I've been standing for years. You heard me because the cameras were rolling. But I've been speaking since I got home. You called me brave, but I was never looking for applause. I was looking for dignity. I'm not asking you to listen now because the world is watching. I'm asking you to listen because this is the last time I'll explain who I am before I go quiet again. Clarence looked at what he'd written, then tore the page from the pad. He folded it neatly, slid it into the envelope with the VA letter, and placed both back into the drawer. Then he leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and let the silence come. This time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a choice. The letter was meant to be private, a message folded into silence, but the world wasn't done asking Clarence Dupree to speak. The mayor's office reached out first, an invitation to appear at a community forum on police reform. Then came the university, asking him to address their annual Veterans Symposium. But it was the invitation from Lincoln High School, just 8 blocks from Henry's Diner, that finally made him pause. A history teacher named Ms. Langston had written the note herself, longhand, like people used to. She'd watched the video with her students. They had questions, she said. And no textbook could answer them. Clarence didn't want to be a speaker. He wasn't a preacher or a politician or a poet. He was a man who once carried a rifle and now carried a memory. But something in Ms. Langston's letter reminded him of Miller, the kid he'd pulled from the rubble with half a leg and more bravery than any general he ever knew. Miller had written letters to his younger brother every week, never telling him about the blood or the noise or the fear. Just stories about stars over the desert, and how the world still had beauty even when it was burning. Clarence remembered thinking, even then, that words could carry more than bullets. So he said yes. The auditorium was full. Not packed like a rally, but full of the kind of quiet that hangs in the air before a storm. Teachers lined the back wall. Students fidgeted with their phones but didn't scroll. Principal Jenkins gave a brief welcome and said Clarence's name with the kind of reverence usually reserved for retired judges or war heroes. Clarence stepped onto the stage with a slow, steady gait. His old boots made soft sounds against the hardwood floor. There was no podium, just a single chair and a microphone on a stand. He didn't sit. He didn't thank anyone. He looked out over the sea of young faces and began. When I was 17, I lied about my age to enlist. I wanted to make my grandfather proud, serve the country that raised me, and maybe find a better version of myself somewhere out there in the world. I ended up in a place where the sky was too bright and the ground smelled like diesel and death. I watched good men bleed into sand, and I learned that survival isn't always heroic. Sometimes, it's just cruel. A girl in the second row lowered her phone without looking down. Silence gripped the room. When I came home, I didn't come back with parades. No one waved a flag when I walked through the terminal. I didn't need them to. I just needed a job. A roof. A place to forget. But instead, I was told to wait. Wait for paperwork. Wait for funding. Wait for someone to care. Clarence's voice didn't rise. It stayed level, grounded, as if each word was a brick he'd carried uphill. So I slept in shelters. I drank bad coffee and kept my back to walls. I learned how to fold my jacket to keep my ribs warm in the winter. I learned how to disappear. And when I sat down at that diner last month, all I wanted was eggs and peace. But what I got was two officers who saw a problem instead of a person. Someone coughed in the back, but no one looked away. They saw my skin. They saw my jacket. They saw the way my boots didn't match. They saw what they wanted to see. And when I didn't stand up, I didn't resist. I just didn't comply with a story they had already written about me. And for the first time, someone recorded it. Clarence paused. His hands were steady. His chest calm. And just like that, I became visible. He stepped closer to the edge of the stage now. You see, the truth is, I didn't do anything new. I've been asking for help for years. I've been sitting quietly in government offices, filling out forms that vanish into filing cabinets. I've been saying the same things, but no one heard me. Not until it was shareable. Not until it could go viral. Not until my stillness made people uncomfortable. There was a long, thick silence. No phones moved now. And that's the problem, isn't it? We've built a world where suffering has to perform to be believed. Where pain has to have an audience. Where a black man has to bleed or break or beg before you'll call him human. Someone in the front row wiped their eyes. Another student nodded slowly, fists clenched on their lap. I'm not here to blame, Clarence said. I'm not here to shame. I'm here to remind you that history doesn't only live in books. It lives in the booths of diners. It lives in the shelters down the street. It lives in people you walk past without looking. And every time you choose not to see them, you help write a story that someone else will have to survive. Clarence stepped back, letting the final words rest in the air. Don't wait until someone is trending to decide they matter. He didn't wait for applause. He nodded once to Ms. Langston, stepped down from the stage, and walked through the aisle with the same quiet dignity that had once held the line overseas. But before he reached the door, someone stood up. Then another. And another. Until the entire auditorium was on its feet, not clapping wildly, but standing in silence. A stillness born not of shock, but of recognition. Clarence kept walking, out into the bright hallway, where the echoes faded and his breath steadied again. He didn't want to be anyone's hero. But maybe, just maybe, he could be someone's mirror. The air outside the high school felt different than when Clarence had entered. It wasn't just cooler, it was charged. Not with electricity, but with something weightier, expectation. The kind that gathered when truth had been spoken out loud and couldn't be unspoken. His words had left the auditorium like embers, drifting out into the streets, landing on hearts that had been dry kindling for far too long. And those embers caught fire. By the next morning, the video of Clarence's speech, recorded from 3 angles by students, had already gone viral. Again. But this time, it wasn't just a moment of confrontation. It was a message. A testimony. A quiet roar that cut through the noise of manufactured outrage and reminded people what dignity looked like when it stood on a stage without asking for applause. The comments weren't like before. They weren't just pity or praise. They were calls. Demands. People didn't just want to thank Clarence anymore. They wanted to act. At City Hall, pressure was mounting. Council members who had sidestepped the issue of police misconduct for years suddenly found their inboxes flooded with emails, their phone lines jammed with constituents asking what they planned to do, really do. Protesters lined the steps for 5 straight days. No chanting, no signs. Just silence. A sea of people sitting down, hands folded, heads high. A mirror of Clarence's act at the diner. The quiet itself became the protest. Officer Langley had already been suspended. Officer Sorrell had been moved to desk duty pending investigation. But the people weren't satisfied with administrative shell games. They wanted accountability, real and public. They wanted answers about hiring practices, complaint histories, racial bias training. The mayor had no choice but to call a public hearing. It was set to be televised. Clarence was invited. Again. He didn't want to go. Not out of fear, but fatigue. He hadn't asked for any of this. He had carried enough for one lifetime, and now the load was being redistributed across a stage he hadn't built. But then Carla called. "You have to go," she said simply. "Why me?" "Because you already started it. And they trust you." "Hell, I trust you." Clarence sighed. "They'll twist it. Make it about optics, about the city moving forward. Nothing's really gonna change." Carla didn't argue. She just said, "If you don't go, it all slips back. Don't let them close the book while the ink's still wet." So Clarence went. The hearing chamber was packed, media, city officials, members of the public, activists, even a few police officers in full dress uniform. Clarence was seated at the front with a nameplate that simply read Mr. Dupree. The chair creaked when he sat down. The lights were harsh. The mayor, now flanked by 2 public defenders and the police commissioner, cleared his throat and opened the meeting with practiced solemnity. "We're here today in the spirit of justice," he began, "to listen, to learn, and to grow as a city." Clarence stared straight ahead. The proceedings dragged. Charts, statistics, body cam policies, all delivered in polished sound bites designed to impress rather than illuminate. But then the floor was open to testimony. One by one, people took the microphone. A mother whose son had been detained for walking home in a hoodie. A retired officer who spoke about the culture of silence in the department. A college student who had marched in the silent protests and now wanted systemic change, not symbolic reform. Then, finally, the moderator turned toward Clarence. "Mr. Dupree, would you care to speak?" He stood, slow but steady, and walked to the microphone. His hands were at his sides. He didn't have a speech. Just truth. "I wasn't gonna come," he began. "I figured the talking was done. But then I remembered something." He looked around the chamber, eyes sweeping across suits and uniforms and folded hands. "When I was in the Marines, we were taught that integrity isn't about what you do when you're watched. It's what you do when you're forgotten." A few heads tilted. A few backs straightened. "I was forgotten for a long time. Not just by the system, but by neighbors, leaders, strangers who walked past me like I was invisible. And maybe that's why this city let what happened to me keep happening to others. Because forgetting is easy when you never take the time to see someone." He paused. The room was silent. This system doesn't need more data or new slogans. It needs courage. It needs people in power to ask themselves not can we fix this but will we? And when the cameras leave and the headlines fade, will you still be listening? He stepped back from the mic. No applause followed. Just a silence too full to break. The hearing concluded, and Clarence walked out the back entrance to avoid the press. As he moved through the corridor, he passed a young officer in uniform who stopped him. "Sir," the officer said, clearing his throat. "I watched your speech at the school. And this. I want to do better. I really do." Clarence looked him in the eyes. "Then do." That night, the city council voted unanimously to create an independent civilian oversight board for police conduct. They passed new policies on accountability, transparency, and bias training. But Clarence didn't celebrate. He went home. Sat in his apartment. Brewed his own coffee. And watched the lights of the city flicker through his window like quiet stars, waiting for dawn. The rain had begun falling softly just after sunset, misting the pavement outside Henry's diner with a silver sheen. Clarence stood across the street beneath a flickering street lamp, watching the place he once entered as a stranger and left as a symbol. The neon sign buzzed faintly above the door, and for a moment he wondered if Carla had already closed up for the night. He didn't move to cross. He just stood still, letting the soft rain cool the warmth in his chest that had been building all day since the hearing. Then he saw him. A boy, maybe 16, sat on the bench outside the diner, his blue hoodie soaked through and clinging to thin shoulders. His head was down, arms wrapped around a tattered backpack that looked heavier than it should. Clarence stepped off the curb slowly, his boots splashing in the shallow puddles as he approached. The boy didn't look up at first, even when Clarence stood directly in front of him. "Waiting on someone?" Clarence asked. The boy flinched slightly at the sound of his voice. When he looked up, his eyes were alert but guarded, the kind of look Clarence knew too well. "No, sir," the boy said. "Just, sitting." Clarence nodded, then sat down beside him without asking. They sat in silence for a while. The rain pattered gently on the awning above them. A car passed with a low hiss. Then the boy spoke. "I saw you on the news," he said quietly. "You're the man who sat down." Clarence didn't respond right away. He just looked out at the street, the traffic light changing to red even though no one was waiting. "I didn't plan on it," Clarence said. "Didn't think I was making a statement. I was just tired. Hungry. Done being pushed." The boy hugged his backpack closer. "They say you changed things." Clarence gave a faint smile. "They say a lot of things." "I don't have anywhere to go tonight," the boy said suddenly, the words dropping from his mouth like a confession. Clarence turned toward him. "Where's your people?" The boy hesitated. "My mom's in jail. Has been for a year now. My uncle was supposed to take me in, but he started using again. I've been at a shelter, but it's full tonight. So," here I am." Clarence looked at him, really looked at him this time. The boy was small for his age, all elbows and bones beneath the soaked hoodie. His sneakers had holes at the toes. His fingers trembled, not from cold but from the raw exhaustion that settled into you when survival became routine. "What's your name?" Clarence asked. "Malik." "Malik," Clarence said slowly, as if tasting the name. "You hungry?" The boy nodded. Clarence stood up, motioned for Malik to follow. Inside the diner, Carla was wiping down the counter, the radio playing low jazz in the background. She looked up, surprise flashing across her face when she saw Clarence, and then concern when she noticed the boy behind him. "This here's Malik," Clarence said simply. "He could use a warm meal." Carla didn't ask questions. She nodded once and disappeared into the kitchen. They took a booth near the window, and within minutes, 2 plates of steaming eggs, toast, and sausage landed in front of them. Malik dug in like a boy who hadn't seen a full plate in days. Clarence didn't eat right away. He just watched, remembered. Remembered what it felt like to be 16 and unsure of where your next meal was coming from. Remembered what it was like to need someone and not have the words to ask. When Malik finally slowed down, he looked up, wiping his mouth on his sleeve. "You were in the military, right?" "Yeah." "What was it like?" Clarence stared into his coffee for a long moment. Some days it was purpose. Other days it was survival. But always, it was about the man beside you. About making sure he came home. Malik nodded like he understood, even if he didn't fully. Then his voice dropped lower. "You think people ever really change?" Clarence looked up. "People, or the system?" "Both, I guess." Clarence leaned back in the booth. "I think people change when they're seen. When someone finally stops long enough to hear them, to look them in the eye. But systems. Systems only change when people push hard enough. Long enough. Loud enough." Malik thought about that. Then, after a beat, he asked, "So what now?" Clarence took a deep breath, then exhaled slowly. "Now, you come with me. Just for the night. I've got an extra blanket and a roof. And in the morning, we figure something out." Malik didn't say anything at first. But his eyes softened, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. He nodded. When they stepped back outside, the rain had stopped, and the city lights shimmered on the pavement. Clarence led the way down the block, Malik close behind. For the first time in years, Clarence felt something unfamiliar swelling in his chest. Not duty. Not bitterness. Something gentler. It was hope. Maybe he couldn't fix the system. But tonight, he could give one boy a safe place to sleep. And sometimes, that was how revolutions started. One act. One person. One quiet choice in the middle of the night. Morning filtered in through the thin curtains of Clarence's apartment, casting a soft golden light across the floorboards. The city outside was already stirring, traffic murmuring like a restless tide, but inside the apartment, everything was still. Clarence sat at the small table by the window with a cup of coffee in his hands. Across from him, Malik was still asleep on the couch, curled beneath a navy blanket, his shoes neatly placed beside him. There was a peacefulness in the boy's face that Clarence hadn't seen the night before. It was the kind of calm that only came when the body finally believed it was safe. Clarence sipped his coffee slowly, letting the warmth pull him away from the weight of the last few weeks. He felt it in his bones, the accumulation of tension, of public appearances, of memories that had clawed their way back into daylight. But in this moment, with the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the soft breathing of the boy on the couch, he felt something else settle in. A rare stillness. The kind that didn't come from giving up, but from having done enough, at least for one night. He stood and walked to the counter, opening a cabinet and pulling down 2 bowls. There was cereal, some milk, and enough bread to make toast. It wasn't much, but it was something. When he turned around, Malik was sitting up, blinking sleep from his eyes, blankets still draped over his shoulders. "Morning," Clarence said. "Morning," Malik replied, voice rough with sleep. "Hungry?" The boy nodded, and Clarence set the bowls down on the table. They ate in silence for a while, the kind that didn't feel awkward but natural, like they both understood that some things didn't need to be said just yet. When Malik finally spoke, it was with a question that hung heavier than the others. "Do you think I'll end up like you?" Clarence paused, spoon halfway to his mouth. He set it down gently. "I hope not," he said. "Not because I'm ashamed of who I am, but because I don't want you to carry what I had to carry. I don't want you to feel invisible. I want you to have choices. I want you to know what peace feels like before you have to fight for it." Malik looked down at his bowl. "I don't even know where to start." "You already did," Clarence said. "You asked for help. That's more than most people ever do." Malik nodded slowly, his eyes wet but steady. "I don't want to go back to the shelter. They treat you like you're a problem, not a person." Clarence sighed. "I know. But there are people out there who care. We just have to find them." That afternoon, Clarence made calls. Not the kind that made headlines or changed policies, but the kind that mattered more. He called a friend from the VA who now worked for a youth outreach nonprofit. He called Carla, who had once offered him a job when he had nowhere to go. He called a pastor he hadn't spoken to in years, a man who used to run a youth mentorship program before the funding dried up. Each call was a thread, and Clarence wove them together slowly, carefully, like someone building a bridge over broken ground. By the evening, he had a plan. A real one. Malik would meet with the nonprofit caseworker the next day. Carla had offered to let him help around the diner for some cash under the table until paperwork could be sorted. The pastor had an extra spot in a weekend program where young men learn trades and self-discipline. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. That night, Clarence and Malik sat on the fire escape outside the apartment, watching the streetlights blink on one by one. "You know," Clarence said, "there's something no one tells you when you get back from a war." Malik glanced at him, curious. "They tell you the hardest part is what you saw, what you did. But it's not. The hardest part is waking up in a place that doesn't know you, doesn't need you, and still figuring out how to live in it." Malik was quiet for a moment. "Do you think I'll make it?" Clarence didn't answer right away. He looked at the boy beside him, saw not just the hardship but the spark, the flicker of resilience that couldn't be taught or borrowed. "I think you already are," he finally said. "Every day you wake up and choose not to give up, that's making it." They sat there in silence for a long time, the city alive beneath them, the quiet between the storms wrapping around them like a shared blanket. Clarence didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know if the policies would hold, if the city would keep its promises, or if Malik's path would stay steady. But for the first time in a long time, he believed that maybe, not today or tomorrow, but someday, things could be different. That maybe the ripples they started wouldn't just fade but become waves. And in that quiet, as the wind passed gently through the alleyway, Clarence Dupree closed his eyes and let the stillness speak for him. Clarence stood in front of his closet for a long time, staring at the jacket hanging at the far end. It was wrapped in clear plastic, just like the day the VA sent it back after he left the service. He hadn't touched it in years. Not because he was ashamed, but because for the longest time it felt like a relic from another life, a life that never truly returned with him. He reached forward slowly, unhooked the hanger, and laid the uniform jacket on his bed. The metals shimmered faintly in the morning light, dull with time but still proud. A folded note was tucked inside the inner pocket, the edges yellowed. He knew what it said. It was from Sergeant Miller. Just one line, "Don't let them forget who you are." That same morning, Malik was pacing the living room in his cleanest clothes, a nervous energy buzzing through him. He was scheduled to meet with the caseworker at 10:30. Clarence had gone over what to say, how to be honest but not undersell himself. Malik had listened carefully, but now the weight of it was settling on his shoulders. He was no longer hiding in plain sight. He was being seen, and that meant he could be judged, could be turned away. Clarence noticed him rubbing the hem of his hoodie like a worry stone. "Come here," Clarence said, motioning to the kitchen table. Malik sat down. Clarence placed a small box in front of him, old and worn. "I want to show you something." Inside the box were photos, most black and white, some faded color. Men in uniform. Sand-covered tents. Helicopters slicing the sky. Clarence handed him one with two young Marines grinning with arms over each other's shoulders. One of them was Clarence, years younger, his eyes bright with the kind of fire time hadn't yet dimmed. "We all start somewhere," Clarence said. "We don't get to pick our beginning, but we can shape where we go next." Malik studied the photo, then looked at Clarence. "Were you scared?" Clarence chuckled softly. "Every day. But fear isn't the end of the story. It's just the start." At the caseworker's office, the air smelled like printer toner and lemon disinfectant. A tall woman with short silver hair and wireframe glasses greeted them. Her name was Angela Holt. She shook Malik's hand firmly, then turned to Clarence. "We've heard a lot about you lately," she said with a small smile. Clarence nodded. "Only believe half of it." Angela led Malik to a small office, and Clarence waited outside. The meeting took longer than expected. Over an hour passed, then two. Clarence sipped lukewarm coffee from the lobby machine and stared at a poster on the wall that read, "Every story matters." He wondered how many stories were buried beneath that slogan, how many kids like Malik had slipped through cracks too deep to climb out of alone. When the door finally opened, Malik came out with a piece of paper in his hand and something else Clarence hadn't seen before, shoulders lifted just slightly, eyes not burdened by the same weight. Angela followed behind. "We're going to start him in the Transitional Youth Program," she explained. "We can place him in temporary housing this week, get him into counseling, and connect him with an educational mentor. He'll need to attend sessions, keep up with a plan, but I think he's ready." Clarence looked at Malik, who was trying hard not to smile too wide. "That sound good to you?" Malik nodded. "Yeah. It really does." As they left the building, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days. It warmed the sidewalk, casting long shadows behind them. Malik walked with a bounce in his step, the paper clutched in his hand like a golden ticket. Clarence walked beside him, quiet but proud. That night, they stopped by Henry's diner. Carla met them with a knowing smile. "I hear you're getting fancy," she said to Malik. He laughed, rubbing the back of his head. "Trying. Well, I've got a few morning shifts coming up," she said. "You show up on time, I'll show you how to run a line." Malik's grin was all teeth and disbelief. "Seriously? Don't make me regret it," she teased, handing him a menu. Clarence watched from the booth, his heart full. He thought about all the nights he'd spent wondering if anything he did still mattered. And now, here was a boy with no reason to believe in the world, believing just a little more each day. Before they left, Clarence reached into his coat and pulled something out, a pin. It was small and bronze, shaped like an eagle perched over a globe and anchor. He held it in his palm, then offered it to Malik. "This was my first Marine pin," he said. "I don't hand it out lightly. But I want you to have it." Malik stared at it, then at Clarence. "I'm not a soldier." "You don't need a rifle to be a warrior," Clarence replied. "You just need heart." Malik took the pin gently, as if it were made of glass. Later, in the quiet of the apartment, Clarence laid the uniform back in its box. But this time, he didn't hide it away. He placed it on the dresser, in full view. Not as a symbol of the past, but as a reminder of everything still possible. A uniform didn't define him. But it reminded him of the name he fought to preserve, not on paper, not in history books, but in the lives he touched one at a time. Because in the end, legacy wasn't about battles won or medals earned. It was about people. About showing up when it mattered. About reminding someone they were never forgotten. And that, Clarence Dupree knew, was a fight worth staying in. The bell over the door jingled with its familiar chime as Clarence stepped into Henry's diner. The air was filled with the scent of frying bacon, brewed coffee, and something deeper, something that felt like home. The same vinyl booths, the same smudged window panes, the same chipped salt shakers sat waiting as if time had paused just for this moment. But something had changed. Or maybe it was Clarence who had. He carried himself a little taller now, not because the weight was gone, but because he had learned how to carry it differently. Behind the counter, Carla looked up from the griddle, spotted him, and nodded. "You're late," she said, but her smirk betrayed the affection in her voice. Clarence chuckled. "You weren't expecting me at all." "True," she replied, flipping a pancake with practiced ease. "But it's good to see your old stubborn face." He sat down at the counter, his usual spot, the worn cushion molding under him just like it used to. He didn't need a menu. Carla poured him a cup of black coffee without asking. Across the room, Malik was wiping down tables, sleeves rolled to his elbows, a dish towel slung over his shoulder. He moved with a new rhythm, not just with purpose but with presence. He caught Clarence's eye and grinned. "Don't worry, I haven't broken anything yet," he said as he passed. "That's more than I can say for myself at your age," Clarence called back. A few customers looked up, some of them recognizing Clarence immediately. One older woman smiled and whispered to her husband. A man in a postal uniform offered a respectful nod. There was no fanfare, no questions, no camera phones this time. Just quiet acknowledgement. Clarence appreciated that more than he could say. Carla set down a plate in front of him, 2 eggs, sausage, toast. "On the house," she said, then leaned in. "You coming in means something." Clarence raised an eyebrow. "To you?" "To all of us," she replied. "You didn't just sit down at this counter months ago. You made the whole damn city pay attention. Now people walk in here a little straighter. You gave the place a spine." Clarence stared at his plate, unsure how to respond. Gratitude wasn't something he was used to wearing. It didn't always fit right. "You ever think about working here again?" Carla asked. He looked up. "You offering?" She shrugged. "I never stopped." Clarence smiled. "Let me think about it. Might need a few more free breakfasts first." Across the diner, Malik had finished clearing his section and slid into the booth across from Clarence without asking. He looked more relaxed than Clarence had ever seen him. Not because life was suddenly easy, but because Malik had started to believe it could be livable. "Angela says I'm doing well," Malik said proudly. "She's got me enrolled in that mentorship program I told you about. And the pastor, he's helping me figure out GED stuff." Clarence nodded. "Good. Real good." Malik leaned forward slightly. "You ever think we'd be back here? Sitting like this? Like none of that other stuff happened?" Clarence shook his head. "No. But I also didn't think that stuff would matter. Not like it has." "It matters," Malik said quietly. "To me. To a lot of us." They sat for a moment, letting the buzz of the diner hum around them. Clarence looked around and realized how many lives this place had touched, not just with food, but with presence. It had been the battleground, the sanctuary, the stage. And now, maybe, it could be the starting line. A man in a pressed suit walked in and approached the counter. He looked out of place among the flannel shirts and delivery uniforms. He introduced himself to Carla, then turned to Clarence. "Mr. Dupree," he said. "My name is Councilman Rivera." I wanted to speak with you, if you have a moment. Clarence glanced at Carla, who raised an eyebrow but didn't interfere. Go ahead, Clarence said. I wanted to thank you, Rivera began. For your testimony. For your courage. I've seen firsthand how the community has rallied. The council's officially passed 2 more reform measures. The oversight board has teeth now. And the funding for the youth shelter was restored. Clarence nodded slowly. That's good news. But don't thank me. Thank the people who showed up after me. We did, Rivera replied. But we also wanted to offer you something. Clarence tensed slightly. What kind of something? The mayor would like to appoint you to the civilian board. As an advisor. We want someone who speaks for the streets, for the veterans, for the ones people forget. We want you. Clarence stared at him for a long beat. Malik's eyes widened across the booth. Take your time to think about it, Rivera said, placing a card on the table. But I think you'd do a lot of good. He left without pressing, the door jingling behind him. Clarence looked down at the card, then at Malik, who was practically beaming. You gonna do it? I don't know, Clarence admitted. I've been a lot of things. Soldier. Ghost. Trouble. Not sure I'm ready to be official. Maybe that's exactly why you should, Malik said. Because they won't expect it from someone like you. And you'll surprise them. Clarence sipped his coffee again. It was lukewarm now, but it tasted richer somehow. Carla wiped down the counter beside him. If you go suit and tie on us, I'm still making you wash dishes when you come in. He laughed. Fair enough. That afternoon, Malik finished his shift and pocketed his tips with pride. Clarence helped Carla fix a loose cabinet hinge behind the counter. The sky outside turned a pale blue, the kind that promised a quiet evening. Before they locked up, Clarence stood in the doorway and looked out at the sidewalk where it had all begun. The same crack in the pavement. The same iron bench. But the weight it carried had changed. He turned to Carla. Mind if I come in tomorrow? Only if you bring those big hands back to the sink. He smiled. Maybe this wasn't the end of his story. Maybe it was just the part where he finally stood up for good. The city was awake before the sun, its heartbeat echoing through honking horns and early footsteps on cracked sidewalks. Fog hung low along the street like a veil over old wounds, softening the edges of buildings that had seen too much. Clarence Dupree stood across from Henry's diner once more, the same place where months ago he had sat down as a weary man with nowhere to go and accidentally sparked a fire too loud to ignore. Now, the street seemed quieter, not because the city had changed completely, but because something inside him had. He looked both ways and crossed. The streetlight above flickered just as he reached the curb. He paused, one hand brushing over the iron bench near the entrance. It was newly painted, sturdy now, as if the city had decided that what once marked the edge of desperation could now stand for something better. He ran his fingers across the cool metal and exhaled. Inside the diner, Carla was already working the griddle. The smell of bacon and fresh bread filled the air like memory. Malik was pouring coffee for a regular who always asked for 2 creams and a smile. He caught sight of Clarence and lifted his chin in greeting, the confidence in his posture unmistakable now. The boy who once sat on a soaked bench was becoming a man who could stand tall anywhere. Clarence entered and moved to his old seat at the counter. Carla poured him a cup before he could ask, setting it down with a look that needed no words. Morning, she said. Morning, he replied. Malik came over on his break and leaned against the counter beside him. You hear the news? He asked, eyes bright. Clarence raised an eyebrow. I've been avoiding it lately. They're naming the community center after you, Malik said. The one near 9th and Redwood. Dupree House. For veterans and kids aging out of foster care. They broke ground this morning. Clarence stared at him, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "You're joking." "Nope. Angela told me herself. Said it was approved last week." Clarence sat back slowly, the words sinking in like stones into still water. He had never asked for recognition. Never wanted his name on anything. But this was different. This was for the ones like him, the ones who were told they didn't belong, the ones who were too proud to beg but too tired to keep fighting alone. This was for Malik. For the man who had given him that one line all those years ago, "Don't let them forget who you are." "I don't know what to say," Clarence finally whispered. "Say you'll come to the ribbon cutting," Malik said with a grin. "And maybe say something that'll make the mayor cry." Clarence chuckled, the sound rough in his throat. "We'll see." They sat for a moment longer, the clatter of dishes and low hum of morning chatter filling the background. It felt full but not overwhelming, alive without chaos. Malik stood up to return to work, giving Clarence a firm pat on the shoulder before heading back to his tables. As Clarence sipped his coffee, the front door opened. A man in uniform stepped inside, young, sharp, eyes scanning the room like he'd just arrived from the base. He looked nervous, a folded paper in his hand. Clarence recognized the stance immediately. Military. Newly discharged. Lost. The man hesitated, glancing around for a seat. Clarence stood, nodded once, and gestured to the stool beside him. "You're welcome to sit." The man looked relieved. "Thanks," he said, taking the spot. "Clarence," he offered. "Darryl," the man replied. "Just got back. Trying to find my footing." Clarence smiled softly. "Then you've come to the right place." Carla brought another coffee, no questions asked. Malik gave Darryl a small nod as he passed. The rhythm had begun again. A new life arriving, unsure and unsteady, stepping into the warmth built by others who once carried the same weight. Later that day, Clarence walked through a small neighborhood near the construction site of Dupree House. The chain-link fence was covered with posters of what the place would look like when it was done: clean lines, bright windows, gardens planted with purpose. He stood by the sign bearing his name, not out of pride, but humility. The kind that grew from knowing the pain of silence and the power of one voice breaking it. He wasn't alone. People had begun to gather. A few of them recognized him. One young woman thanked him for what he did. A teenage boy asked for a picture. Someone called out, "We need more like you." Clarence shook his head gently. "You don't need more like me," he said. "You just need to see the ones already here." That evening, Clarence sat on his fire escape, Malik beside him again. The sky had turned gold, the city hushed in its twilight rituals. "You really think things are changing?" Malik asked. Clarence didn't answer right away. He looked out across the skyline, the buildings casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the horizon. "I think change is like a tide," he said slowly. "Sometimes it comes slow. Sometimes it crashes in. But it always starts with a single drop." Malik nodded, his voice soft. "You were that drop." Clarence chuckled. "Nah. I was just a man who sat down when he was told to walk away." "But you didn't leave," Malik said. "That's what made the difference." Clarence glanced at him and smiled. "Neither did you." As the night deepened and the lights of the city blinked to life one by one, Clarence Dupree felt something settle inside him. Not the burden of the past, not the ache of what had been lost, but the quiet certainty of what had been found. A seat that became a stand, a name that became a shelter, and a story that no longer belonged to just him, but to everyone who believed they were invisible until someone chose to see them. The bench outside the diner was still there. Solid. Waiting. Not a symbol of defiance now, but of invitation. And somewhere in the silence, it whispered the same message over and over. You belong. You matter. You are not forgotten. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?